What if I told you that $21 could feed you for an entire week? Not sad, flavorless meals, but real food with real flavor that actually keeps you going. Before we get into it, this video is for anyone who has ever stood in a grocery store aisle doing the math in their head, calculating whether the total is going to be over budget before they even get to the register. This is for the person who has had to choose between two items because they could only afford one. This is not judgment. This is not a stunt. This is a real demonstration of how far a small amount of money can go when you know what to do with it. And if you are currently going through a hard stretch financially, the first thing I want to say is that asking for help is never something to feel ashamed about. Communities exist precisely so that people can lean on each other during difficult seasons. If you need resources, try asking neighbors or people in your community whether they have any extra pantry items they are looking to clear out. You can also dial 211 from any phone and get connected to local assistance programs in your area. That connection costs nothing and could open doors you did not even know existed. Now, the store I am shopping at today is Walmart, and my total budget is $21. Prices will vary depending on your location, so if you are watching from somewhere else, the numbers might shift slightly. What stays consistent is the strategy. The goal here is not to show you the perfect version of eating on a tight budget. The goal is to show you one honest, workable version of it, the kind of version that a real person can actually pull off. Let me show you everything I brought home. The first thing I picked up was a 5-pound bag of flour, which came to $2.38. Flour is one of those foundational ingredients that quietly carries an enormous amount of weight in a tight budget week. From bread to pasta to thickening a sauce, the applications are nearly endless. Next up, 3 bags of frozen vegetables. Frozen vegetables are genuinely underrated. They are picked at peak ripeness and flash frozen, which means nutritionally they hold up extremely well. The frozen broccoli florets came in at $1.16. A bag of mixed vegetables was 98 cents, and a bag of frozen green beans was also 98 cents. 3 bags of vegetables for just over $3 total. That matters. 1 can of mixed chili beans was 86 cents. A large can of diced tomatoes came to $1.48. The plan had originally been to grab some Roma tomatoes. They were priced at 98 cents per pound. But they were completely sold out, so canned it was. A pound of brown rice was 88 cents, and a pound of dried pinto beans was exactly $1. Pinto beans are the move when you are working with almost nothing. They are among the cheapest dried beans available. They are filling, they are packed with protein and fiber, and when cooked correctly they taste genuinely good. Do not let anyone tell you that budget food cannot be satisfying. That is simply not true. A pound of frozen ground turkey was $1.98. A quart of whole milk was $1.64. A jar of peanut butter came to $1.98. A 3-pack of active dry yeast was $1.14. A dozen eggs was $1.97, and bananas came out to 50 cents per pound. With roughly 1.8 pounds of bananas in the bag, the total for 5 bananas was 91 cents. With about $1.50 left in the budget, there was just enough room to grab 1 tube of beef chorizo from the refrigerated section. That was the final item, and it rounded out the haul beautifully. Now, there was one ingredient I had been hoping to include that did not make the cut, not because of price, but because of quality. Avocados were 62 cents each, and with roughly 15 in the display, it seemed like an easy win. But every single one of them was in rough shape. Even the ones that looked green on the outside had clearly been mishandled. Soft in all the wrong spots, bruised through. Buying them would have been throwing money away. So the original plan to use 2 avocados across 4 breakfasts had to be scrapped entirely and replaced with something else. Flexibility is part of the skill set here. Everything went to its proper place. Frozen vegetables into the freezer, the turkey into the fridge to thaw overnight. And now it was time to start cooking. One thing worth mentioning. In videos like this one, a small set of pantry seasonings is kept on hand. Not purchased within the budget, but available to use. Things like hot sauce, Italian seasoning, onion powder, salt, pepper, chili powder, soy sauce, chicken bouillon, and a neutral cooking oil. These are the kinds of ingredients that most people already have sitting in a cabinet somewhere, and they make an enormous difference in transforming simple ingredients into something that actually tastes like a meal. The first task for the day was getting bread dough started. Quick note before going further. Buying bread at the store is completely reasonable. A loaf from Walmart is not expensive. Same goes for a box of pasta. If the idea of making things from scratch feels like too much, there is no shame in skipping it and spending $1 or $2 on a loaf of store bread. The homemade route here is a personal choice. It is enjoyable, and the results are worth it when the energy is there. But it is absolutely not a requirement. For bread, the milk gets used first. Just under 300 milliliters, roughly 1 cup plus 3 tablespoons, was warmed up in the microwave until it hits somewhere between 100 and 105 degrees. If you do not have a thermometer, think of it as the temperature of a genuinely warm bath, comfortable but with real heat to it. The warmed milk went into a mixing bowl along with the full packet of active dry yeast, a light stir, and then a few minutes of waiting. With yeast activated in milk rather than water, you may not see the dramatic foam you are used to. What you are looking for instead are small bubbles rising from the bottom. Once those appear, the yeast is doing its job. To the yeast and milk mixture, add a couple tablespoons of oil, a teaspoon of salt, and a little bit of sugar if you have it. There was a sugar packet that had been sitting around for ages, the kind you get at a coffee shop and forget about. And it went in here, which is exactly the kind of resourcefulness a tight budget week demands. 3 cups of flour went in next, and everything was stirred together until a rough, shaggy ball of dough formed. Then hands went in for a light knead. The goal is not a fully smooth dough at this point, just enough to bring it together. If the dough feels too dry and stiff, the easiest fix is to wet your hands and introduce moisture gradually. Adding water directly to the bowl is risky because it is easy to overshoot, and then you need to compensate with more flour, and the cycle just repeats. Wetting your hands and working it in slowly gives you much more control. After a few rounds of that, the dough looked right, slightly tacky, holding its shape. It got covered and left to rest for 30 minutes. Not a full rise yet, just a rest. That short window relaxes the gluten in the flour and makes the dough much easier to shape afterward. After the rest period, the dough was folded a handful of times and shaped into a loaf. It went into an oiled pan, got covered again, and was left to rise until roughly doubled in size. Then into the oven at around 375 degrees for somewhere between 30 and 40 minutes. The result was a soft, slightly chewy loaf with a beautiful crust. Real, homemade bread, on a $21 budget week. Here is what often gets left out of budget cooking conversations. The thing that makes tight budget eating genuinely sustainable over time is not finding the single cheapest item in every category. It is building meals that feel like actual food. A meal that satisfies you, that you look forward to, that tastes good, is one you will actually eat. And eating consistently is how you stretch a budget across a full week without falling apart on day 4 and spending money you did not plan to spend. Rice and beans, for example, are a cornerstone of budget cooking in almost every culture around the world. There is a reason for that. They are cheap, they are calorie-dense, they are nutritious, and when seasoned properly, they are deeply satisfying. But on their own, they can feel monotonous. The trick is to build variations on top of that foundation. The dried pinto beans were soaked overnight. Soaking is not strictly required, but it cuts down the cooking time significantly and makes the beans easier to digest. After soaking, the beans were drained and covered with fresh water in a pot, brought to a boil, and then simmered until fully tender. That took roughly an hour and a half to 2 hours on a low, steady simmer. Patience here pays off. Properly cooked dried beans have a texture and creaminess that canned beans simply cannot match. Once the beans were cooked, a portion of them went into a pan with the ground turkey, the diced tomatoes, the chili beans, and a combination of the available seasonings: onion powder, chili powder, salt, pepper, and a splash of soy sauce for depth. This became a thick, hearty filling that would serve as the base for multiple meals across the week. Think of this mixture not as one dish, but as a building block. It could go into tortillas and become a burrito. It could sit on top of rice and become a bowl. Add broth to it, and it becomes a soup. Keep it thick and fold it into a flatbread, and it becomes something entirely different again. The same core ingredients shifting into multiple forms. That is how you get through a full week without feeling like you are eating identical meals every single day. The brown rice was cooked separately. 1 part rice to 2 parts water, brought to a boil, covered, and dropped to low heat for about 18 minutes. Then left to sit off the heat, still covered, for another 10 minutes. Fluffy, toasty, fully cooked rice that would pair with almost everything else being made this week. Bread was sliced and stored. Some slices went into the freezer to preserve them for later in the week. This is a habit worth building. Freeze what you will not eat immediately, and pull it out the night before you need it. Bread that might go stale by day 3 stays good for the full week when frozen, and it toasts up beautifully from frozen. Now, what about breakfast? The avocado plan had fallen through, which meant a pivot was needed. With eggs, chorizo, tomatoes, and tortillas available, the obvious move was breakfast tacos, or more accurately, oversized breakfast burritos. The kind of thing that is deeply, unapologetically filling. The chorizo went straight from the freezer into a warm pan. One of the advantages of this style of chorizo is that the fat content is high enough that it cooks down from frozen quickly without needing any added oil. It is a different product from a high-quality fresh chorizo, fattier, more processed. But it still delivers flavor, and flavor is what makes meals feel worth eating even when circumstances are tight. Once the chorizo was broken up and cooked through, the remaining canned tomatoes went in to simmer alongside it. This did two things at once. It added richness to the mixture, and it cut down significantly on the amount of grease spitting out of the pan. A little bit of liquid in a high-fat pan changes the whole dynamic of cooking it. 4 eggs went into a bowl with a small splash of milk and were whisked together. A space was cleared in the center of the pan, and the eggs went in, low and slow, keeping the curds large and the texture soft. Once the eggs were mostly set, everything was folded together, eggs, chorizo, tomato, into one unified filling that smelled incredible. Tortillas. These were handmade using flour, oil, salt, and water, the most basic recipe imaginable, and one of the most satisfying results in the kitchen. Mix the dry ingredients, add the fat and water, knead briefly until smooth. Rest for 30 minutes, divide into portions, roll each one out thin, and cook on a dry hot pan for about 45 to 60 seconds per side. The tortilla blisters and puffs slightly, goes soft the moment it comes off the heat, and wraps around a filling like it was made for exactly that purpose. Because it was. Each tortilla was filled generously. Some would say overfilled, but there is no shame in that. With the chorizo and egg mixture, folded closed, and placed seam side down on a hot cast iron pan to crisp up on the outside. The result was a browned, slightly crunchy exterior, giving way to a warm, savory, deeply flavored interior. 3 of these were made at once. 1 for that day, and 2 wrapped up for the following 2 mornings. They reheated well in a microwave, not quite as crispy, but the flavor held up completely. For a busy morning when there is no time or energy to cook, having something like this waiting in the fridge is genuinely valuable. Now here's a question worth sitting with. When you are eating on an extreme budget, what is the thing that most often causes people to go off track? Is it hunger? Is it boredom with the food? Is it a craving for something specific that the budget simply cannot cover? The honest answer is usually all 3, and the solution to all 3 is variety. Not expensive variety, structural variety, using the same set of core ingredients but assembling them differently so that each meal feels distinct from the last one. A rice bowl and a burrito can share 70% of the same ingredients and still feel like completely different eating experiences. A soup and a stir-fry can come from the same base and still feel like you made 2 separate dinners. That mindset shift, from thinking of individual ingredients as individual meals to thinking of them as flexible components, is one of the most powerful things you can internalize about budget cooking. Pasta was made using flour and water, no eggs. Just enough water to bring the dough together. A little salt, kneaded until smooth, rested, rolled thin, and cut into strips. The resulting noodles cooked in about 2 to 3 minutes in boiling salted water. Simple, genuinely filling, and made from something that cost a fraction of $1. A peanut sauce was put together using peanut butter, a little soy sauce, hot sauce, and a splash of warm water to thin it out to a pourable consistency. This went over the pasta along with some of the green beans, which had been quickly blanched in the same pot of water used for the noodles, saving both time and fuel. The result was a dish with warmth, richness, and a little heat that felt far more restaurant-worthy than the ingredient list would suggest. The roasted broccoli was another standout moment of the week. Frozen broccoli, thawed and patted dry, tossed in a small amount of oil, salt, pepper, and onion powder, then spread on a sheet pan and roasted in a hot oven until the edges went dark and crispy. Roasting frozen vegetables is a step many people skip because they assume frozen means it cannot caramelize. It absolutely can, and roasted frozen broccoli is significantly better than steamed fresh broccoli in terms of flavor and texture. Served alongside the rice and bean mixture, This made a genuinely satisfying lunch that felt balanced and intentional. Here is another question. What role does mental energy play in budget cooking? Because it is real. Decision fatigue is real. When you are already stressed about money, the last thing you want is to stand in a kitchen for an hour making complex decisions about dinner. That is one of the reasons batch cooking and meal prep matter so much in a tight budget week. Spending a couple of hours on the first day to cook a big pot of beans, a pot of rice, a loaf of bread, and a base filling means that for the rest of the week, meals are essentially assembly jobs. Pull the components out, combine them differently each time, reheat, eat. That reduction in daily decision-making is not a luxury, it is a strategy. By the middle of the week, the meal rotation had settled into something that genuinely worked. Breakfast tacos in the morning, a variation on the rice and bean base for lunch, pasta with peanut sauce or a burrito for dinner, and bananas as afternoon snacks. Each day felt distinct enough that it did not feel like repetition even though the core ingredients were largely the same. The bean and turkey patties were another pivot that came out of having extra cooked pinto beans toward the end of the week. Cooked beans were mashed, combined with a small amount of the ground turkey, seasoned with onion powder, salt, and chili powder, formed into small flat patties, and pan-fried until browned on both sides. Eaten on a slice of homemade bread with hot sauce, these were genuinely good. A filling, high-protein option made from things that were already on hand. This is the kind of cooking that happens when you stop seeing budget ingredients as limitations and start seeing them as prompts. The limitation is not the enemy. The limitation is the creative constraint that forces you to think differently about food. By the final day of the week, the pantry looked like this. 4 eggs remaining, roughly a cup and a half of flour, nearly half a container of milk still left, less than a quarter of the peanut butter jar, about half a cup of rice, 1 packet of yeast, a small amount of bread still in the freezer, a good portion of the dried pinto beans, and several of the bean and turkey patties. Not a full pantry by any means, but not nothing either. If a second week of the same $21 budget were to follow immediately after this one, those leftovers would function as a foundation, a small but meaningful head start that would expand the options available for that second week considerably. This is actually the piece that tends to get left out of discussions about ultra-tight budget eating. The first week is always the hardest. The pantry is starting from zero, which means the entire budget has to go toward building from scratch. By the second week, there are already oils, spices, partial bags of flour, leftover grains, and those things compound. They make the second week cheaper and more flexible than the first. They make the third week more flexible still. The constraint loosens slightly over time if the approach is strategic from the beginning. That is the long game of budget cooking, not just surviving the week, but building incrementally towards something that gets easier as it goes. Eating on $21 for a full week is not glamorous. There were moments during this week where something like a handful of shredded cheese or a couple of extra eggs would have elevated a meal dramatically, and they simply were not available. There were moments of wanting a fresh vegetable that was not in frozen form. There were moments where the same base flavors showed up in yet another guise, and the mind registered the repetition, even if the assembled dish was technically different. That honesty matters. Pretending that budget eating is entirely cheerful and effortless does no one any favors. The reality is that it requires more planning, more creativity, and more patience than cooking with a generous budget. It asks more of the person doing it. Acknowledging that is not complaining. It is being realistic about what the experience actually involves. And yet, the week was genuinely fed. The meals were genuinely satisfying. Not every one of them was a triumph, but several of them were genuinely good. The kind of good that would stand up regardless of budget. The roasted broccoli, the pasta with peanut sauce, the breakfast burritos, the fresh homemade bread. These were not consolation prizes. They were real food made with intention and care. That is what this whole exercise points toward. Not that $21 is enough to live on comfortably. That would be dishonest. But that with the right approach, even $21 can produce an entire week of real, nourishing, flavorful food. And for someone in a genuinely tight spot, that knowledge can make a real difference. Before wrapping up, here is a quick overview of how the days broke down. Day 1 covered bread making, cooking the base filling, and preparing the rice and beans. Dinner was the first burrito assembled from the filling. Day 2 was a breakfast taco, a pasta and peanut sauce lunch, and a rice bowl for dinner. Day 3 brought another breakfast taco, roasted broccoli alongside the bean and turkey mixture for lunch, and a homemade flatbread with the chorizo and egg mixture for dinner. Day 4 started with a banana, moved through a soup made from the leftover filling with added broth for lunch, and a thick bean stew with bread for dinner. Day 5 was a bean and turkey patty on bread for breakfast, pasta again for lunch, and the third and final breakfast burrito for dinner. Day 6 featured the last full breakfast taco, a peanut butter and banana sandwich for lunch using the last banana, and a final bowl of pasta with peanut sauce and the remaining roasted broccoli for dinner. Day 7 rounded things out with the last breakfast taco in the morning and the final rice and bean burrito for lunch, with the remaining filling eaten as small snacks throughout the afternoon. Every meal accounted for, from $21. If this kind of content is useful to you, consider sharing it with someone who might need it. And if you have been watching for a while and have not yet hit the like button, taking 2 seconds to do that genuinely helps get this content in front of more people who are looking for exactly this kind of practical, honest cooking content. That is what my channel is here for. Real food, real budgets, real results. No fluff, no pretense. The world has enough content about cooking with premium ingredients in a pristine kitchen. What is harder to find is content that meets people where they actually are, with what they can actually afford, and shows them what is genuinely possible. That is the intention behind every video on this channel, and it will continue to be. Thank you for spending time here. Now go make something good,